What is going on, guys? Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Sadu, and today we're going to be chatting about how to deal with frustration and disappointment in regards to fat loss, because it can be a super difficult undertaking. Now, the coolest thing about this process that I'm going to lay out for you is that it can be applied to any area of your life that you're feeling frustrated or disappointed in. So it's got a ton of carryover, which means it can be a really useful tool in your life toolkit. Now, we always want fat loss, or most things for that matter, to happen faster than they're currently happening. If we're dropping a pound a week, we want it to be 2. If we're losing 2, we want it to be 3 or 4. And that's just human nature. So let's just acknowledge that right out of the gate and put it to the side for now. So first off, if you're feeling frustrated or disappointed, congrats. You want a different outcome, and that's exciting because that frustration or disappointment that you're feeling is the first step to change. If you never felt frustrated or disappointed with the way something in your life was going, you'd never change it because why bother? What this means is that frustration and disappointment are really valuable emotions because they ignite transformation. They have us examine something in our lives and acknowledge that we're not stoked on the way things are as they are now, and that provides an opportunity for something different. So the first step in this process is when you notice frustration and or disappointment coming up is to acknowledge it. Okay, I'm feeling pretty frustrated here and I'm not happy with the way things are going right now. Easy enough first step, right? Step number 2 is to own the fact that what you're currently doing isn't working. Because if it was, you wouldn't be feeling disappointment or frustration. You'd be feeling satisfaction and excitement. Step number 3 is to ask yourself, what do I need to change? Because of course, if you want a different output, i.e. results, you need a different input, i.e. your behavior. Once you've established what it is that you need to change in order to get the result that you're after, now it's time to ask yourself the most important question in this entire process, and that is, am I willing to implement that change necessary in order to get the result that I say that I want? That is step number 4. Am I willing to implement that change necessary in order to get that result that I say that I want? If the answer to that question is no, frustration and disappointment be gone because you know what you need to do and you're not willing to do it for whatever reason. And therefore, there's no need to feel frustration or disappointment because clearly you just don't want that outcome enough. You want a different outcome more. It's essentially just a cost-benefit analysis. For you as an individual, what is required to get that result that you thought at one point that you wanted isn't worth the payoff. On the other hand, if the answer is yes, I am willing to implement the change necessary to get the result that I'm after, that dissipates frustration and disappointment entirely too, because now all you've got to do is implement that shift, and now it's only a matter of time until you reach your goal. Let's go through a specific example to make this super concrete and clear. Let's say you want to get lean enough so you have a completely flat stomach, not like a six-pack, but you want to look down at your stomach and have it look flat. You're implementing better eating habits, you're moving more, you're sleeping better, and you progress to a point where your stomach is almost where you want it to be, but you've just got a little bit of fat hanging around your belly button. Some of my clients call this a little pooch. So you're working at it and you notice that you start to feel frustrated because you want that flat stomach, but it just ain't happening right now. You've established that you want something different, the last little bit of fat to dissipate. You know that what you're currently doing isn't quite getting you there. You then establish what you need to change, which when it comes to fat loss is always input-output. So essentially nutrition and or movement, but typically it's mostly nutrition. And you ask yourself, am I willing to implement a calorie reduction in one way or another? Let's say you examine your weekly intake and in scenario number 1, you are willing to implement the change necessary. Great, you do it and you ride off into the sunset with a flat stomach that you always wanted. In scenario number 2, let's say you just can't possibly fathom reducing your intake further because that would mean that you need to cut back on your alcohol intake by say 30% and eat 2 fewer meals out at restaurants per week. In this case, the answer to the am I willing to implement the change necessary is no. And in both scenarios, there's no room for frustration or disappointment because the ball is in your court. You either deem the result worth the sacrifice or not worth the sacrifice. It's really as simple as that. Now, I want to mention a vital pitfall because where folks run into issues with this process is they want the answer to the what do I need to change question to be different than it is. They want to be able to have their cake and eat it too, meaning they still want the result, but they don't want to change anything on the front end. And in this setup, you can literally be frustrated and disappointed for the rest of your life because the process requires what it requires, and you cannot change that. It takes what it takes to lose fat and get the body that you want. However, if you're not willing to meet those requirements, but you still want the result, unfortunately, that's just not how life works. It's like wanting to become a doctor, looking at the schooling and residency requirements, and then feeling frustrated because you have to do the schooling and residency. What it takes isn't going to change. You have zero control over the necessary steps to become a doctor, so you've got a decision to make as to whether the cost, going to school and doing residency, is worth the payoff, becoming a doctor. But getting stuck where you're just perpetually frustrated about what it takes and what you have to do to get what you want is pointless because you can't change it. It requires what it requires. You either do what's necessary to get the result or you don't. There's no good, bad, right, wrong, or anything of the sort when it comes to this stuff. It simply comes down to, is it worth it to you? Is the benefit worth the cost? If the answer is yes, great. If the answer is no, that's also great. Because again, we only run into issues with frustration and disappointment when we want what it takes to be something different than what it in fact takes. That's the only situation that leads to feeling dissatisfied long term. Fortunately, the ball is in your court, and that's great news because the choice is yours and you don't have to do anything that you don't want to do. It's actually beautifully simplistic. But oftentimes we want to complicate things like this, and I'd argue that complicating something that isn't complicated is just an avoidance tactic. Now, I know some folks might literally be thinking right now, Marcus, it's more complicated than that. I've got a job, I've got kids, I've got a mortgage, I've got this, I've got that. Look, I am not saying that your priorities should not be your priorities. I couldn't change them even if I wanted to. What I'm saying is, we've all got 24 hours in a day and we spend those hours exactly how we want to spend them. We eat what we want to eat, we drink what we want to drink, we watch the shows that we want to watch, and we say the words that we want to say. This is meant to be an empowering message because it will free you. It's ultimate ownership of your life, actions, and behavior. And again, this is awesome news because we can have pretty much anything we want. We just can't have everything we want. So there are choices to be made, and fortunately, you get to make those choices and no one else. Now, I am aware that some folks aren't going to like this message, and I'm also aware that some folks probably already turned off this short podcast because taking ownership is fucking hard. It means that we've got to own it all, not just the things that we like in our lives or the things that we like about ourselves, but also the things that we don't like about our lives and ourselves. And that's why this concept is so off-putting to some folks. It's actually even harder the older you get because if you're, say, 60 right now and you take this ownership concept on 100%, however you hadn't up until this point, you're now forced to acknowledge that the prior 60 years are on you. Sure, life happens, circumstances happen, and all of that, but ultimately the buck stops with you, and addressing that at 60 can bring up a ton of regret. Addressing it at 30 can bring up a lot of pain. I can attest to that. Know that this stuff is hard, but I promise you will be a completely different person if you take this to heart. And I'm saying that from personal experience. When I decided to take full ownership in my life, it changed me. It changed how I felt. It changed my friendships, my relationships with women, my career, my family life. My results improved in every aspect. And yes, it's been painful, but so worth it. I want to leave you with a personal example of where I wasn't taking ownership of my life just to illustrate this point a little bit further. I have been super fortunate in the fact that I've dated incredible women and I've learned so much from them along the way. However, I kept running into the same issue over and over, and it was that I would date someone or get into a relationship and then I would feel trapped. Now, I would be perfectly okay acknowledging that I wanted something different to not feel trapped. However, I would always screw up at step number 2 because instead of looking at myself and saying, what am I doing that isn't working? I would look at the other and say, it's because of you. It's because you're not sporty enough or funny enough or sweet enough or fill in the blank. I didn't get to stage number 3, 4, and 5, and shocker, I would always run into frustration. I'd break the relationship off, I'd feel untrapped, and then just repeat that cycle over and over. And looking back at my pattern now, I was clearly the common denominator. I was feeling the same way with all of these different women who were in fact different, but the feeling for myself was the same. So instead of holding myself accountable and saying, Marcus, you clearly need to change something if you want a different result, I would look at the other. Now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes I'd date someone and it clearly wasn't the right fit, but there was a clear pattern on my part that happened too many times not to acknowledge. And once I did acknowledge it, holy shit, was it difficult to transcend it. And to be honest, I'm still working at it in my current relationship. But I just remind myself, if I want something different or if I want to go somewhere that I've never been before, I've got to be willing to do something that I've never done before. I hope you found this episode useful and I hope you implement this process because it works. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's going to be easy, but I am saying that it's really not that complicated. It's highly difficult and painful, but it's not complicated. And if you have the urge to complicate this process, just know that it's an avoidance tactic and you're going to keep running back into the same wall over and over, just like I did, until you address the necessary steps. You can use this to reach your fat loss goals. You can use this process in your relationships, your career. It will work anywhere and everywhere. If you're interested in applying for one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can click the link in the description below or head on over to n1fitness.com/coaching. Follow me up on Instagram at n1fitness. And feel free to friend me on Facebook at Marcus Sadu. And lastly, be sure to hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you're using. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I will catch you on the next episode. See ya.